It's a story about World of Warcraft in specific, but it's also a story about every video game. In a way, a story about video games themselves. It's a story about why it's rude to be bad at World of Warcraft. It's December 2004. Massively multiplayer online role-playing game World of Warcraft is taking the world by storm, and Wallace, the gnome rogue, walks barefoot through molten core. Wallace, a proper hobbit of a gnome, doesn't wear shoes, and he's not in a hurry to get anywhere. His guild thinks this is a little embarrassing, but it mostly just makes for a story about a quirky weirdo they met in this new video game. Ultimately, they enjoy having Wallace around because he makes the game fun. 6 months later, they're screaming at Wallace and demanding that he equip some boots. Ultimatums are dropped, tempers are elevated, and no one's having a good time. Someone calls Wallace a bad player. No one disagrees.
Instrumental play was first described by literary theorist Wolfgang Iser in his 1993 essay The Fictive and the Imaginary. Iser, a highly influential theorist, saw plays being divided cleanly into the categories of free and instrumental based on how the act of play related to goals. On the one hand is play unburdened by systematized goals, and on the other hand, play with goals. In Iser's framework, play becomes instrumental the moment it has some intended outcome, something resembling rules and structure. However, in Iser's work, this was largely to distinguish between children chasing each other around a field for no other reason than because it felt fun in the moment, and children chasing each other in a game of football with concrete winners and losers. Its discussion in relation to video games is credited to sociologist T.L. Taylor in her 2006 book Play Between Worlds. Instrumental play is a goal-oriented approach that values efficiency, expertise, and optimizing strategies as part of play. In instrumental play, the point of playing is not to reach the end, but to find the best way of getting there. This is, for the record, not a discussion of good players as opposed to bad players. We are talking about the ways you play the game in which being good is considered desirable. This is a critical distinction, and perhaps if there's going to be one takeaway from all of this, it is this confrontation. The idea that being good at a game is a good thing, that the correct way of playing a game is one in which you are good at the game, isn't some natural force of reality, but an imposed value. If you've ever gotten destroyed in a video game and felt awful about it, just ashamed of how hard you got thumped, that feeling isn't objective or natural. It is an instrumental value that you are imposing on yourself.
It's common for instrumental play to be framed in opposition to fun, that they are ends of a spectrum. This is understandable in no small part because instrumental play tends towards optimization, which can often result in deeply unfun player behaviors. This gets extended out to the extreme where play framed around challenge or investment is treated as irrational or somehow less genuine than some hypothetically more pure, innocent, unadulterated version of play, unconcerned with doing well. It's important in this conversation to establish firmly that this is a false dichotomy. We are going to spend a lot of time talking about how fun gets optimized out of games, which is why I want to stress that they are not antithetical concepts. Rather than being in conflict with one another, they are instead in tension. There is not an opposed relationship, but there is a complex one. Because if you back up and think about it, it's easy to appreciate how someone can find a deep enjoyment in improving at a skill, or achieving goals, or discovering solutions to complex problems. Rather, instrumental play focused on goals, can be juxtaposed with free play, the form of play that is without ending. Neither free or instrumental play can exist in their purest form, but René Glass in his book Battlefields of Negotiation describes play in World of Warcraft as movement between instrumental and free play. For every arena match or dungeon, there is a time before and afterward when you're waiting in town and just stand there, aimless. This moment, this is free play approaching its pure form. An important consideration here is that game design can rarely compel the player to take action. A game can attempt to prescribe an action, such as the famous press F to pay respects, but players tend to chafe against moments like this, as in clumsy hands they tend to come off as naive or insincere, or, in the language of the youth, cringe. If you refuse to pay your respects, then that's it. The game doesn't even end so much as it just bricks, a standoff between you and a choice that doesn't exist. Whether or not you close the application, if you refuse to pay your respects, you functionally stop playing the game. World of Warcraft offers players a tremendous amount of agency. It is, after all, an entire virtual world. You are, indeed, broadly free to not pay your respects, and the game is generally cool with that. You can shun levels, talent trees, and even weapons, and still play the game for a very, very long time in a way that is still identifiably play. Why shouldn't you stand facing a wall on the far side of Bloodmist Isle and contemplate the nature of the Draenei forever? Jokes aside, role-playing is a genuine example of the value of free play and the fuzzy edges of instrumental play. Role players engage with World of Warcraft in a fundamentally different way than how you or I might engage with it. They are often less concerned with the explicit objectives of World of Warcraft and instead prefer emergent activities. By shunning the game's progression system, there's a clear embrace of free play here. But when role players self-direct, say by holding an annual festival that raises tens of thousands of dollars of charity year after year, they are creating their own goals, and that morphs into a form of instrumental play. In this sense, you cannot have free and instrumental play in their purest forms. You might be surprised just how much of the study of WoW is concerned with role-playing because it reflects a fascinating alternative and socially driven means of engaging with a game. And that nuance, that question of how you can enable a form of play that, by definition, doesn't concern itself with, like, the numbers, the spreadsheets, the statistics, all the stuff that the game is fundamentally made of, that is awesome. Blizzard can't force you to stop staring at the wall, but they can encourage and discourage certain play practices, and, very rarely, abolish them in their entirety. In Battlefields of Negotiation, Glaz's core insight is that Blizzard is not an omnipotent god in the World of Warcraft. The developers are not the arbiter. Yes, they have immense influence and a form of final say, but they are ultimately a stakeholder who push their vision of the game, which either aligns or resists against the player base. Writing on Lineage 2, Professor of Informatics Constance Steinkuhler describes MMOs as defined by a mangle of play, the push and pull relationship between game developers and their players. Blizzard has access to certain tools and means of creating the legitimate World of Warcraft experience. They have control over the servers and decide what bespoke content gets made and implemented, but they are not the sole hand attempting to sculpt the game. MMOs are interactively stabilized systems, co-evolutionary, the emergent result of the intersection of designers armed with their technology and players armed with their own practices. Blizzard has code, the players have codes of practices. Social codes of practice are the tenets laid down by individuals within the game who have no design power or automatically conferred authority. These social codes are often linked with perceptions of foul play and the spirit of the game, but they go far beyond that and can shape what is considered legitimate play in World of Warcraft. In Elite Noobs, Mark Chen sees success in World of Warcraft as dynamically defined. To be good at World of Warcraft is defined by consensus. Put another way, you are good if you do enough of the things that we collectively decided that good players do. Success is relative and socially defined. For example, arena rating was very inflated in Season 2 of Shadowlands. While a typical season tends to have a median rating around 1600, Season 1 was severely deflated with a median rating of 1426. Some behind-the-scenes tweaking leading into Season 2 resulted in a median of roughly 1750. In the abstract, both of these are fine. The actual underlying mechanics of matchmaking are all relative. The numbers are arbitrary. If you are a high-level competitor, the experience on a match-to-match basis is generally the same regardless of what the median rating is. The shape of the curve remains the same, it's just shifted upwards. The hitch is that certain rewards, like titles, achievements, and armor, are hard-coded to specific ratings. So the inflation resulted in the prestige rewards being available to more players than usual, many of whom would never have qualified for it under different circumstances. This led to a rather vocal belief that these rewards were illegitimate. They didn't count. Despite the game layer presenting these dragons as equivalent, there is a significant difference in their social value. For Glaz, World of Warcraft is composed of various idiocultures, groups of players linked together by particular systems of knowledge, belief, behaviors, and customs. Big boy raiders and role players have totally different ways of engaging with the world.
I'm out of
There is no
range.
single objective way to
Ability is
WoW. These idiocultures exist in layers. You've got WoW players categorically, PvP versus PvE, battlegrounds versus arenas, keystones versus raids, guilds, individual guilds, and of course cliques within those guilds. And players can move seamlessly between all of these different modes, all of these different idiocultures. These different idiocultures may subscribe to different social practices, and it is the interaction between these groups, the constant negotiation on proper codes of practice, that Glaz argues shapes World of Warcraft. It is the interaction between different groups of people that set the boundaries and fundamental meaning of play. Instrumental play has entrenched itself as the dominant mode of engagement with World of Warcraft. Through social codes of practice, players are subject to
So much damage as a cat.
they may be completely unaware of. It is taken as value neutral and objectively
Is there
true
trouble?
that expertise and success are the natural objectives of play, and thus the default
still
mode of play that
recharging.
players owe to those around them. In other words, it's bad manners to be bad at Warcraft.
We're going to take a moment to talk about the Great Vault. If you play World of Warcraft, then you probably already know how it functions, and if you don't, then all you need to know is this. At the end of every week, you get to pick one reward from the grid that fills up as you do
the
specific
great
group
outdoors.
activities. Options are dictated by difficulty and volume. Do more stuff, get more picks. Do higher difficulty stuff, get stronger picks. Case study A. During the Shadowlands Season 3 Race to World
Hi.
First in the US 2nd Guild of BDGG, our players were required to fill all 9 slots to their maximum potency on multiple mirror mains. Since there is an
What
element
is
of luck to
nature's
gearing
call?
up, the top players prepare multiple copies of the same class in order to have a few pulls at the slot machine and maximize the chances of a favorable outcome. For this particular raid tier, our movement player prepared 3 separate druids. Our Death Knight raider prepared 4 Death Knights. Each of these characters had the same odds of being the main character, based hugely on the outcome of their vault rewards. These are players who are paid in dollars for their time as part of a pseudo-professional
Holy shit, do I dunk.
achieving the absolute optimum performance in
Starfire's
the raid environment is part of
sexy.
their literal job description. This expectation was only maintained until the progression
Not
of
even
the raid was over,
expensive.
at which point no one cared. Job
Takes a
done.
long time to cast.
Case study B, Venture on Barthalas, US rank 180th. They are a 2-night-a-week guild that have some very different ideas on the vault. If you'll allow us this one indulgence, let's just take a moment to dunk on an incredibly stupid opinion. If some of this goes over your head, don't worry about it. I promise you will pick up on the important parts. So it's Season 3 of Shadowlands, almost 3 months into a 4-month season. Our good friend and contributor to the show, Crystal, has just come back to the game after a lengthy break, so we spin up a group and spend a few hours hanging out and doing dungeons. In terms of gear, Crystal is wearing old junk, and so the rest of us have elected to bring alts. But a member of our group, the tastefully named Moist Rainbow, opts to bring his main character, in
can't
part to make it
cast
easy
that
for
yet.
us, but also to fill out slots in his vault. Moist Rainbow is doing this for
Holy
specific
shit.
item, the coveted Unbound Changeling. This is one of the best trinkets in the game for healers and casters at this point in time. We end up doing over 8 keys, but only about 4 of them are at level 15. Moist Rainbow does not do any other keys for the week. So at the end of the week, this is what his vault looks like. He has 3 chances at the Unbound Changeling, 2 will be at the maximum possible level. The Changeling is one of 91 possible items. Huh. That's good, right? Yeah? A little bit? Okay, having just consulted with the team just then, a player getting their best in the slot trinket is good. Like, if you had a 1% chance of the best thing happening,
The great
This
outdoors.
would be that, because it's the best.
Alright,
in the
we
slot.
saved her.
But Venture felt differently. They came down hard on Moist for not maxing out that final slot. There was explicit shaming, snarky remarks, even cowardly announcements from leadership about players needing to do their part for the team. And perhaps on the face of it, you're empathetic to all that. But we have been pissed off about this incident for almost 6 months, so just give us a minute. Remember, this was a piece of gear generated solely for Moist Rainbow. This is not typical loot drama. There was no alternate home for this trinket. The issue was entirely in the missed opportunity at a stronger version. Gear in World of Warcraft is comprised of stats that are assigned based
power's
on individual
below.
item's overall budget, dictated by its slot and by its level. These stats all do and mean a lot of different things. So the ultimate unit of measurement we use to value a piece of gear is to calculate its contribution to the player's damage. How do we do that? Well, it's easy. We build a robot to play our character perfectly while wearing both items.
I wonder if it's something I gotta get off of them.
Just for certainty, and then compare the results.
I need to get closer.
Typically, a higher item level should translate to a better item. However, trinkets are not like other pieces of gear. Their item level can be deceptive. A trinket lives or dies on its effect. So, this Unbound Changeling was the best possible trinket with an item level of 272, down 6 item level from the maximum. If we compare simulation results from a destruction walk at the time, we can see that the difference is barely perceptible on the graph. This particular simulation values the overall impact at 0.6%. Here are some more details on that if you're interested. But we've buried the lead on this because Moist Rainbow isn't a warlock. He's a goddamn healer. And healers are a whole different deal. Healers don't have the same simple, tangible benefit from gear as damage dealers receive. For well over a decade, it has been standard practice for guilds to starve their healers of gear on the basis that they don't really need it. We don't even have any real way to even quantify this difference for a healer. So while this would not be at all accurate, let's be generous and assume that it would match
slow
this
staff.
0.6% figure. This was in the context of a guild that was 9 weeks behind the progression curve, working on bosses that had been hit by the nerf bats several times. And just for those in the know, these people were 6 healing Mythic Lords of Dread in early June. Like, I don't even have the words. Gear was not their problem. So, a close friend of mine was bullied and excluded from this group for not spending a few more hours running dungeons to load the bases for a 1% chance at a maybe 0.5% increase in performance, where that improvement was entirely disconnected from the problems that the group was actually experiencing. The reason we wanted to talk about this is that I sincerely could not imagine a more petty reason to give someone a hard time in World of Warcraft. Frankly, it's pathetic. This was not an instrumental.
How old is this? Oh, not very old.
Social one. Here, the social value of the item level was wildly disproportionate to any tangible mathematical value. The process of completing the necessary 8 keystones was not emergent from some necessity, but a ritualistic reaffirmation of commitment to the group. The fact that the trinket was worth something, anything, was just a pretense to enforce a practice.
My god, I love Starfire. This thing smacks.
Early attempts at anthropological studies of virtual worlds.
I'm a little confused. Maybe I'm not.
Look back on them as hopelessly naive, but I prefer to categorize them as bad.
Keep murdering these people for nothing, I think.
Spaces to rope them off from reality and paint them as a separate, self-sustaining world, an actual destination as disconnected from the rest of reality as the moon, or perhaps Australia. In Coming of Age in Second Life, Tom Bellstorff conducted a study of user experiences in Second Life, but critically did not involve the user's real life.
My gosh.
That's still recharging.
Analysis. The work drew criticism from Alex Golub, who identified this as a dramatic oversight. The virtual worlds of MMOs are not enclosed worlds.
My experience with World of Warcraft is not limited to the executable file on the hard
Are they
drive.
supposed to drop it or
Discord,
something?
Twitch, Twitter, Google Docs, they are all places where I can engage with World of Warcraft without inhabiting World of Warcraft. I work as a contributor to Skillcraft, an analyst at BDG. I produce my own YouTube content. I might at this point spend more time doing WoW outside of WoW than I spend inside of it. So we have MMO Champion, WoWhead, or whatever. The term we'll be using for this material is paratext. If you're into a certain lame type of YouTube video, paratext is a word you'll have heard before. It's one of those words that is thrown around kind of haphazardly. The concept of paratext was originally conceived by French literary theorist Gerard Genet.
I bring that guy's the book and Ironforge? No way.
But also containing other components that were necessary for the book to be complete, but that were not an element of the primary text. You have the actual story of Warcraft Druid.
Something tells me he'll drop the
cover,
book.
The title, the foreword, and so on. Things that
need to
aren't
get
the
closer.
text, but still influence the meaning. The title gives you some idea as to
That
what the
spell
book
is
is going to be about. The illustration might tell you what a certain character might look like. For Jeanette, all that additional text required to make the work complete was paratext. So we can all agree that this is fascinating stuff, really interesting. But let's be real, it's not a growth industry, is it? Like, in the year of our Lord 2022, there is not a groundswell of interest
Too far away.
in a body of academia focused solely on books. And not texts, but physical books. There have been attempts to apply
That's still
to the
recharging.
internet. If you've encountered the term paratext in the wild, it likely wasn't
I'm
your
out of
definition,
range.
but rather the definition attributed to Mia Consalvo. Consalvo is a comps professor who tastefully and delicately, but firmly, expanded upon Jeanette's formulation.
For Consalvo, paratext was any text that may alter the meanings of a text, further enhance meanings, or provide challenges to sedimented meanings. So, paratext are texts that exist to influence what we think of a separate primary text. This is reviews, walkthroughs, pre-release trailers, and
I'm
so on.
22.
The material that surrounds,
I would
shapes,
like my
support, and
levels.
provide context.
Oh, I
for
know what I
texts.
can do.
There is a legitimate criticism to be made that this ever-broadening definition is quickly becoming so vague as to lose all meaning, but for our purposes, this is a blessing. Wowhead and Warcraft logs are paratext for World of Warcraft. Developer interviews are paratext. Forum boards and Twitter threads have been called paratext. Podcasts, fan art, and machinima straddle the blurry line of being both text and paratext, converting the original text into a paratext that provides context and meaning to the derivatives. Add-ons have been called paratext. Whatever this is, paratext.
2, 3, 3,
Ooh, where? Oh, right in front of my Fazafe. That man is exhaustively annoying to hear.
Holy shit, those kids are literally so garbage.
In most media,
too
a
far
movie
away.
or painting is produced, and then paratext is produced, which can then act on
Can't cast
the
that
dominant text. A particularly incisive review can persuade you into a given reading of the story and themes, or fan fiction can emphasize the prominence of romantic tension that would otherwise appear subtle or even non-existent, that kind of thing.
That spell isn't ready.
Maybe if a movie gets a sequel, the filmmakers will respond to what people liked or disliked, and thus the paratext has influence over subsequent texts. It is common for paratext to alter the way that people talk about something, but for the most part, that's where it stops. It is very rare for paratext to go beyond that and actually alter a text. World of Warcraft, like many online games, has a bit of a different relationship. World of Warcraft is constantly being updated and altered. There is no static final product that can sit on shelves and be dusted off by critics decades later, and since WoW is constantly being updated, so is a lot of the talk about WoW. The paratext is in a constant state of churn in lockstep with the game. At a basic level, paratext is a form of feedback for the developers. YouTube videos critical of certain changes, bad reviews of an expansion launch in major outlets, explosive forum threads, or viral tweets. The developers and writers are in an inevitable dialogue with these paratexts, as subsequent updates to the game will inevitably be read as either integration or rejection of the vision presented by those outlets. But beyond that, paratext interacts with social practices. Paratext emerge from, create, and disseminate social practices, and what then tends to be prescribed are ideals of instrumental play. When a new strategy or idea is discussed, people make guides or posts discussing it and push it out into the world. That then influences how the game is played and what practices are considered correct and legitimate. The expression of this can be surprisingly pervasive in really unexpected places, such as which of two perfectly symmetrical hallways is the correct path to take. There is a shocking amount of social friction that can be generated by looking at two identical choices and picking the one other players weren't expecting. In the sepulcher of the first ones, these two paths at the entrance are the same. They're literally identical. There is absolutely nothing to distinguish going left from going right. But for whatever arbitrary reason, looking for raid groups have established an entirely unspoken assumption, a rut-like convention that you go to the right. If you get dropped into a randomly assembled LFR group and you lead the group down the left path, people will yell at you. These are the foundation of all the small rituals players engage in as they wordlessly navigate a dungeon for the 50th time. These are the rituals that allow players to just
That's still
know
recharging.
what their expected role is, why they are the one expected to stand somewhere or do something without anyone saying anything. Many of these silent ruts are just that, ruts of habit with no consequence, but the reactions get even more intense if there are consequences, even trivial ones that can be mathematically quantified in some way or another as less efficient practice.
In the Playful Dungeon, the first boss, the delightfully named Globgore, will summon sets of slime creatures that will make their way toward him.
Elune
If any
be
reach
with you.
Globgore, he will be healed for a portion of his health. Low difficulty
Elune
or on
light your
usually
path.
just turn and kill the slimes, but at the highest difficulties, the standard practice is to focus damage on the boss and prevent the larger slimes from reaching the boss with crowd control. If executed correctly, this positioning and strategy trivializes the fight. It's not difficult, but the risk is enormous. Any breakdown in the management of the slimes can immediately break an entire dungeon. Upon first discovering the strategy on a Twitch stream, we became immediate evangelists for the Globgore Gambit. We essentially became agents of the strategy and went on to spread its influence even further. To quote Christine Ask, Theorycraft and Paratext both spread and stabilize Theorycraft expertise, co-producing a more performance-oriented playstyle. Put another way, when players Theorycraft, when they come up with strategies, when they run math through spreadsheets to decide which option is numerically superior, and these strategies proliferate through the player base, they don't merely spread the specific strategies, but also legitimize and elevate the act of theory crafting itself, and push all players indirectly towards a playstyle where optimization is the correct mode of play. World of Warcraft is so interesting because it has lived through multiple generations of community. Because the game is so influenced by paratext, changes in our capacity for paratext manifest as changes in the game itself. As the internet changes how we communicate, the way we talk about WoW also changes, and that fact changes WoW. In the game's early life, Thoughtbot and later WoWhead were famously major users. They were only as good as information users gave, and it took a long time for the sites to build up a repository of it. And that didn't guarantee accurate information, just the existence of information. However, as Mark Chen points out, that didn't stop these sites from being expert practice. Actually,
Get closer.
rather than being seen as cheating, using Wowhead was a thing that the best players did. And in 2006, it relied on word of mouth. You had to be told about Thoughtbot to learn about it. In her book Cheating, Consalvo points out how common it was for strategy guides sites like GameFAQs to be perceived as cheating, as illegitimate practices. So it's interesting how WoW would invert that dynamic at a similar period of time. And as Ask points out, that's weird. When World of Warcraft released, streaming video was in its earliest stages, and it has persisted from that through to the live HD videos on YouTube, through to 1440p live streams on Twitch. Like, this is actually worth stressing, because it plays into the way that information spread. Information asymmetry has changed over the course of the game. If you were watching a strategy video in 2007, it looked like this. But today, in the sci-fi future of the 2020s,
Now, when the fight starts, you're going to want to spread out and take positions somewhat similar to this. Now, the reason you're going to want to be spread out like this is because Archmod has an ability called Air Burst. Now, this does 1,500 nature damage and a 15-yard AoE around his target.
in his 2013 thesis, Play to Win, Benjamin Eggleston predicted the rise
may
of
I
Twitch
help?
streams as a
Be careful.
primary source
Goddess,
of knowledge
watch
for
over
World
you.
of Warcraft. The printed strategy guides that Consalvo wrote about already feel like a distant memory. In 2022, it's common for players to seek out primary sources of knowledge in the form of Twitch streamers or relevant Discord servers. Someone looking how to play a Blood Death Knight in Keystones has access to live streams from dozens of excellent Blood DKs, potentially hundreds of hours of VODs to comb through. Taken in its totality, the effect of all this material can
brings
be
you here?
somewhat insidious. When discussing strategy guides, Consalvo observed that these guides taught young players that exploration, persistence, and strategizing were essential to succeed in their given game. Essentially, the strategy guides taught its
Good luck,
readers
friend.
what it meant to be an ideal gamer. When Choice makes one of his dorky PvP guides and pushes it out onto the internet to wither on the vine, it implicitly communicates that instrumental values are desirable traits. The video inadvertently reinforces the idea that watching PvP guides is a good thing to be doing. Each video represents a brick in an echo chamber that carries a subtle yet deafening resonance. The value ascribed to these videos turns the game's best players into the game's biggest celebrities. This accelerates the process as their expert practices gain increasingly rapid adoption. Christine Ask first observed this phenomenon over a decade ago. Imagine having this ringing in your ears for so long. What would that do to a person?
This robot is a product of Paratext. It's an understatement to say that simulations have become entrenched in World of Warcraft. They are a core pillar of the game, and are often the foundation on which other pillars rest. Best in slot lists, gameplay guides, even boss strategies themselves are built off principles that arise from simulations and the values they carry. When referring to the combat logging site Warcraft Logs, Eggleston said such applications are now used casually, reinforcing competition at all levels of play. Through the production of paratexts, competitive players are not only creating emergent tools for cultivating tactics, but also repositioning the skilled player as an influential force in game design. This state of affairs has become so normalized as to be seen as value neutral. In the case of WoW, because of the pace at which paratext is incorporated into the game, either explicitly as feedback or implicitly as a dialect of design, the barrier between WoW and its paratext has become so thin as to be non-existent, and nowhere is this more apparent than the subject of add-ons.
Add-ons are, of course, software that can be run inside of another piece of software. Add-ons were a major pillar of PC gaming in the late 90s and early 2000s, and they remain extremely relevant through to today. Many famous titles began their life as mods. Many titles are socially considered unplayable without modding. Some legacy titles are literally unplayable without them, especially as hardware and operating systems leave them behind. And mods are a wonderful tool for budding game devs to learn the craft by poking around and fiddling with a completed project. Mods are still around, but mod support is far less pervasive than it was 20 years ago. Today, if a game has mod support, it tends to be a hugely influential aspect of the game. Titles like Minecraft, Oxygen Not Included, City Skylines, and indeed World of Warcraft don't see mod support as an extra little feature, but a core element of their game's identity. So while mods haven't gone away, their scope is far more limited. In 2022, the biggest titles are online competitive multiplayer games driven by live service monetization. Titles like Counter-Strike or League of Legends place huge emphasis on their competitive and esports elements. These are games where the integrity of the competition is critical. Support for add-ons represent an unstable element that few game developers get involved with. In fact, most developers of esport-adjacent titles have an extremely harsh view on any third-party software that interacts with the competitive element of their game. There are a few exceptions. Team Fortress 2 gives the player the ability to alter the game's HUD. The power the user is given to change the UI is pretty dramatic. However, they cannot add new UI elements,
out of range.
only alter the presentation of base elements. The closest comparison I was able to find to a WoW UI mod was like Simple Radar for Counter-Strike. This is a major point of departure for World of Warcraft. WoW wants to be counted amongst your League of Legends and Valorants, and while WoW laid a lot of groundwork for the modern live service model, WoW wasn't built to be like those games. It was built to be like EverQuest and Dark Age of Camelot, both games from the early 2000s with mod support. Mods in that era were significantly less potent, and the competitive instrumental play of 2022 didn't really exist in EverQuest in 2003. There is an old Alakazam tutorial on modding in EQ from February 2003, and it lists the following hypothetical uses of mods.
Mods can introduce new information or functions into the EQ interface, make things easier to use, or make the playing screen more pleasing to the eye. They can turn your cursor into a Nature Walker's scimitar, put a dragon in your spellbook, and put every important zone, location, or trait skill recipe only a mouse click away while you're in-game.
These are not what we would today consider gameplay-altering mods. They are aesthetic and ergonomic changes. These are precisely the kind of mods that developers at the time would anticipate users creating, and the appeal of these mods are pretty clear. Users are empowered to sculpt the game to their own liking, and that remarkable feature is almost entirely outsourced. Mods offer huge value to companies who are the ultimate beneficiaries of the work of passionate volunteers. In 2003, the developers working on World of Warcraft were not making a competitive title, they were making an Elder Scrolls Ultima EverQuest type thing. Of course, a few people would inevitably min-max the systems, like any other Dungeons & Dragons descendant, but the decision to support mods wouldn't be one with decades of consequences. Probably.
World of Warcraft, in a lot of ways, is a victim of its own success. Its extensive mod support is a relic of a bygone era. Mods today are more powerful than the founders could have imagined. We can argue whether or not Blizzard should have locked down their API more during
Too
development,
far away.
but ultimately that frames the debate as Blizzard needing to save us from ourselves. The decision to give mod developers freedom, though perhaps naive, was rooted in player and consumer empowerment, as mod support so often is. It's what modders created and our eagerness to embrace them that put us in this position. So while this may seem redundant, we want to take a second to draw a distinction between add-ons and, well, add-ons. On the one hand, we have mods like OneBag, Aurora, and MyRoleplay. Mods that improve the user experience or offer some new feature without influencing combat. I would rope most of the Dragonflight UI customization options into this category. On the other hand, you have Bigwigs and Gladius, whose whole purpose is to improve player performance in combat. These are mods whose creation and use is predicated on instrumental and expert practices, which is to say, these mods exist to provide information that allows you to improve your performance. Since these mods are used explicitly in pursuit of an advantage, a conversation about cheating and legitimacy naturally follows. This is not a binary, but rather a spectrum, based on how much cognitive load the mod is carrying.
The seminal authority on this incredibly niche concept is Mark Chen's 2011 dissertation, Leet Noobs. Chen wrote extensively about add-ons and their influence on raid practices as early as 2006, but his insights have only grown more relevant over time as the influence of add-ons has grown. In Leet Noobs, Mark Chen is concerned with how raid groups become successful and the complex social and technical systems that emerge in a coordinated raid environment. Chen sought to demonstrate how add-ons could become essential to a raid. To begin, Chen develops on Edwin Hutchins' concept of distributed cognition. For Hutchin, many cognitive tasks can be conceptualized as activities that can be offloaded onto material resources. If I take notes on a sheet of paper, if I jot down the passcode to a door or the location of a hidden treasure, I am offloading the cognitive tasks of memory onto the pen and paper. The pen and paper are assuming certain responsibilities. They are not passive things, but are actively performing a duty of carrying a cognitive load on my behalf. Chen takes this concept to its logical extreme and asks whether it even matters whether an actor in a given system is human or non-human. This concept is called object-oriented ontology, where everything exists equally. Tools are treated as though they have agency. My brain and a pen and paper are equally capable of accomplishing the task of remembering my doctor's appointment. There are certainly critiques that can be made of this framework. In the context of note-taking, it could be argued that the paper merely enhances my memory rather than assuming responsibility, but as you will see, certain mods are so potent at taking on responsibility that agency is probably the best way to describe it, so it's the framework that we're going to use here. This leads Chen to a lengthy discussion of actor network theory. A&T posits that the roles and responsibilities within a network of activity, such as an organization or a raid group, are distributed across multiple actors. An object-oriented ontology tells us that those actors need not be human. And since a raid group is nothing more than a network of actors, Chen argues that add-ons can become essential agents in a raid environment.
So the add-ons we are most concerned with are the ones that take on some cognitive load that would otherwise be placed on players, individually or collectively. From this, we can place mods on a kind of abstract spectrum of just how much cognitive load they carry. A lot of mods we just don't care about, such as those cosmetic or ergonomic mods, because they carry no meaningful cognitive load in combat. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Gladius, Diminish, or Omnibar, and they carry a very high amount of cognitive load because they desperately want to contribute to combat. The smallest example of a useful mod we can think of, our minimum unit of cognitive load, would be the crosshair. It's not uncommon to see top-end raiders play with a weak core that marks the center of their screen, representing where their character is. Your character cannot typically leave the center of your screen, so strictly speaking, the crosshair is entirely redundant information. It is an actor whose role is to answer a question whose answer never changes. Where is my character? It's in the middle of the screen, where it always is. And yet, if we show you footage of a modern raid, you can see how the crosshair can decipher the visual noise. Where is my character is a simple question to answer, but having that certainty, having to not take the extra split second to find your dude in the chaos, that is valuable. And that task can be offloaded to two brightly coloured lines. In recent years, competitive raid guilds have made a big deal out of the 21st Raider, an additional player outside of the raid that coordinates players as the raid's leader via live streams.
Beam's here. And this beam is going left. Dear God, give us a good beam.
Traditionally, that role is performed by a player within the raid, but the demands of the role have grown to the point where a player within the raid is not expected to carry that amount of cognitive load. The cognitive load of managing the raid has been outsourced to an additional actor who is not on the raid frames. However, that idea is not remotely new. T.L. Taylor, writing in 2009 on the subject of raiding in Molten Core, framed a predecessor to DBM as a kind of autonomous agent, the 41st member of the raid. It's quite common for raid mods like DBM or Bigwigs to assign players to certain locations or to perform certain duties. On the Mythic Jailer encounter, 6 players are marked as the bomb. They're about to explode. To keep their friends alive, they each need to jump in their own unique hole. To minimize the amount of coordination or communication required, players offload the problem onto a mod. An add-on assigns each player their own hole, and your duty as a raider is to do what you are told. By the time this goes live, progression for Vault of the Incarnates will begin in less than a fortnight. A huge point of discussion for us has been how to best utilize mods to assume as much responsibility as possible. Just how much of our raid leader could be replaced with MS Susan?
In Elite Noobs, Chen discusses at great length how the creation of threat meters affected his guild. We take it for granted today, but in early WoW the threat system was a black box. The lack of knowledge around threat meant that players couldn't necessarily optimize their damage, because if they did too much damage, they would simply pull aggro and die, and you couldn't put a number to what too much damage even was. Chen describes in detail his guild's theories on how threat functioned. I won't get into those details, but it was a vision of threat that had rogues afraid to ever press Eviscerate, a core ability that famously was kind of important. It was worth a press.
Eviscerate has static damage.
Early theories on threat were similar to Anixia's famous Deep Breath. It was shrouded in half-truths, vague uncertainties, and a healthy dose of superstition. Threat in 2004 was what we'd today call a vibe. You felt it out. A scenario like this, where DPS are deliberately holding back their damage due to concerns about threat, it significantly increased the difficulty of bosses. Ultimately, players dug in and surfaced all the information about how threat actually functioned. The superstition was replaced with absolute knowledge. A mechanic that was previously invisible but still present was made visible in order to be made useful. The process of threat was now a process of real-time data analysis. If the rogues saw that they had a decent buffer on threat, they could press Eviscerate where they would have once hesitated. As tools, the damage meter naturally preceded the threat meter, but in the early days, the value of damage meters wasn't appreciated. Chen observed that his guild members initially struggled to see the purpose or value in these tools. He invoked the metaphor of trying to describe a bicycle to a fish. But once they were adopted, they quickly became essential to Chen's guild, and the threat meter naturally elevates the damage meter. Because ultimately the value of threat management is measured in damage per second. The creation of the threat meter created the conditions that allowed players to optimize their damage output, and thus legitimized the damage meter as a meaningful signifier of contribution. The reason why we articulate the value of gear in terms of damage per second is because DPS is the base unit that we use to measure value to a raid. What was once the central pillar of the DPS experience, the vibe-based management of threat, was completely changed almost overnight. In the years that followed, threat became a rudderless system, ignored by players unless they chafed against it. Over the years, Blizzard has had a few cracks at making it relevant again, but as you'll recall, the creators can't force it. In modern context, it is easy to view this as a positive thing. Threat sucked as a mechanic, and the game is better off without it sitting on top of everything. That may be true, but because nothing with WoW is simple, there is more to it than that. Chen describes a couple of different players from the early days, each with various quirks, but for narrative simplicity we're going to merge them into the archetype of Wallace, a character who walks between encounters and doesn't wear shoes, two real behaviors that Chen witnessed.
Like, there was one of my guildmates, not guildmates, raid mates, so he was in a different guild. he played this character who refused to wear boots or footwear. Like, every piece of clothing or item you get can add to your stats, right? So to not wear boots is a handicap.
Too far away.
But like, we didn't care because he was role playing and he was having fun and stuff, and so like he never ever wore footwear. And there's another person who never ran, which is a total pain in the ass because like you have to wait for this person to take forever to get to wherever you're going. But like he never ever ran in the game, which is ridiculous.
The experience of the Wallaces of the world was to
Never
rapidly
ran.
see the attitude of the world shift around them, from light roasting over silly character decisions to active hostility. Threat meters changed what raiding meant. To RP walk everywhere wasn't a cute character trait, it was leaving the job of trash clearing to everyone else. Wallace's lesser contribution could be portrayed with the objectivity of mathematics. This is how social practices change and how mods can drive that change. Threat meters and damage meters created a new framework for which WoW could be viewed by players, and as an individual, you could either accept that change or leave. Wallace not wearing shoes shifted from being a self-imposed limitation with very nebulous consequences to being a very precisely quantifiable measure of exactly just how much Wallace was failing to play correctly. And in defining what it meant to correctly play World of Warcraft, we narrowed down those legitimate means of inhabiting Azeroth. In doing so, the infinite world that so enthralled those anthropologists grew just that little bit smaller. A typical single-player game may be built with instrumental play in mind, it may even distinctly cater to it, but peak instrumental practices can often be quarantined from mainstream view. Think speedrunning. I love Dark Souls 3, but have never seriously looked at speedrunning it. In comparison to regular play, the speedruns look incoherent. The two are disconnected to the point they're functionally different games. A rich speedrunning scene can exist without it influencing my experience of the game. World of Warcraft, in contrast, has a very different relationship with instrumental practices. You can't really escape them, even if you try. Even the social elements of the game, things seemingly free of numbers, become vessels for the propagation of numbers. WoW is a big game and is extremely complex and is composed of nearly 2 decades of sediment, long strings of stuff positioned with little baked-in explanation for what it's for, why it's there, or even if you should bother. When new content is introduced, no one goes back to the old stuff to drop signs saying, hey, this place is kind of done. You sure you want to be here? There's a lot of reasons for that, namely it wouldn't even necessarily make the game better, but it's a thing, and as a result it creates a lot of cul-de-sacs. If you stumble into the Molten Front in 2022, it's kind of left to you to figure it out. The game's not going to tell you that this content stopped being relevant November 29th, 2011. So, given the existence of these cul-de-sacs, what is always the first piece of advice given to new players? Join a guild. Find people who will help answer questions and offer guidance. People who are up to date on the game, who can collectively remember what things are and point you at what you can or should be doing. Who can tell you that the Molten Front is not only a cul-de-sac, but also kind of lame and there's not a lot of reason to be there. Whether it be that kind of spontaneous, organic help or the systematized information from elitist jurist forums, guilds are repositories of knowledge. Christine Ask describes guilds as communities of practice, as institutions that store information. They are communities defined in part by what they do and why they do it. From the very start, players are primed to engage with WoW as a process of adopting certain practices. World of Warcraft is a game with a large degree of interdependence, and interdependence is always a tricky mix of reliance and imposition. In order for you to accomplish your goals, you may require me to perform a certain task to a certain level of proficiency. And if I can't do that, well, odds are no one's going to be happy with what happens next.
That's a fucking 50 DKP minus!
WoW's raiding environment pushes this to its most extreme. As you'll recall, Chen describes a raid as a network of actors, like a musical band, sports team, or school project. As a scheduled, regular social obligation, it's fair to say that some degree of success is required to keep players motivated to attend. No one wants to feel stuck or left behind. As discussed earlier, it can be said that success in WoW is socially defined. What it means to be stuck depends on where everyone else is. The raid groups that perform the most effectively tend to do so by treating raiding essentially like work. Their work defines what success looks like in the game, and in turn their practices become the expert practices, as anyone who doesn't want to feel stuck adopts their strategies, their group compositions, their add-ons, and their organization, because there might be a bunch of different strategies that do work, but we know theirs does work, and if it works, it must work for a reason.
For instance, Limit achieved the world first kill of N'Zoth by using an external raid leader. The raid group was managed and coordinated by someone who was not among the 20 players inside the instance. This was not unheard of, but it was not a common practice until Limit's success. 3 years later, it's a ubiquitous tactic in the world first race, and our friends over at Adventure, the Trinket guys, they love the external raid leader. From Twitch streams to full strategy guides, guilds like Limit create paratext that document their practices. This paratext not only contains the methodology to overcome a specific boss fight or fix a certain problem, but you'll recall it also normalizes itself as a legitimate framework to apply to raiding. This is a byproduct of emergent play. The game's best players have gotten very good at finding unintended solutions to the challenges put in front of them, which means that what they end up doing can often be in conflict with what the intuitive solution would appear to be. Over the course of years, theory crafting has become so entrenched in the minds of even casual players that it appears value neutral. The way we conceptualize a raid encounter, the terminology we use, the way we judge success, it is all informed from behaviors disseminated from the top down. Even when we do see innovation emerge from relative unknowns, like Restricted's awesome Mythic Jailer strategy, those strategies are still products of instrumental practices. This goes beyond stabilization of theory crafting as an abstract value. This is extremely tangible. This level of instrumental play creates a player base that is better and more coordinated than they otherwise would be. Blizzard can either ignore this and create encounters that are trivialized by add-ons and other techniques, or they can presume that they will be used. This has gradually resulted in content that presumes the existence of these tools and thus pushes players further toward adopting them. We have seen this phenomenon play out quite rapidly in the game's competitive PvP. Mods that were once prohibited from tournament play have become permissible, and their rate of adoption has skyrocketed. This had tremendous implications on the game's balance. The players who had a culture of minimizing add-on usage suddenly started outperforming all expectations and legitimized mod usage in a community that would otherwise be very reluctant to ever use mods. The game designers sought to offset the mods, and the game now demands an air horn whenever a monk casts Bone Dust Brew. The only solution to the impact of mods is to rely more on those same mods. It's a feedback loop. As the Race to World First has continued to pursue professionalism, we've seen add-ons become a crucial element of this process. For years now, the contending guilds have had honest-to-God software developers on their roster to develop specialized software to assist in boss encounters. Weak Auras is a mod that is so powerful, it's not even accurate to call it a mod. It is one part software development language, one part mod distribution platform. It would be easier to list the things that Weak Auras cannot do. It could be used to single-handedly rebuild an entire UI. It could be the only mod you ever use, but even that is underselling this thing. Weak Auras have become the first port of call for any problem in high-end raiding. Applying the principles of cognitive distribution, the first question in response to any problem is, can a weak aura handle that? To which the answer is most often, yes. It is increasingly common to see mods form the spine of strategies from these top guilds. Many encounters, such as Mythic Fate Scribe, have strategies that rely on weak auras to effectively execute. Since deferring to weak auras is the first choice, it is extremely rare for an alternate solution to emerge. What is there to gain by digging your heels in and not using the assignment weak aura for jailer rooms? Since no alternate solutions exist, these weak auras become fundamental tools that are adopted basically universally. The same tools designed by and for professional raiders end up as standard practice. A popular observation regarding add-ons is the way in which they enable or encourage surveillance among players. A mod like CT Raid Assist would function if players weren't using it, but its effectiveness was predicated on mass adoption. In the case of these auras, they require everyone in the raid to use them in order for them to function correctly. If you join a raid and don't have the correct pack installed, all the little elves that tell everyone where to stand during Prototype Pantheon melt down. This has led to the creation of weak auras that ensure you have the right weak auras. Sepulchre of the first ones was just dominated with this bullshit.
So, to recap, strategies seep from the top down. The strategies that the best guilds use inform the techniques that will see mass adoption. Smart practice for these guilds is to offload responsibilities onto add-ons wherever possible, which results in a critical mass of strategies that build themselves around these tools. Since there is rarely incentive to develop an alternative practice, tactics grounded in these mods see near total adoption. These tools rely on players running the software individually, so players have next to no say in whether they install this software, and because this practice is so widely adopted, Blizzard, quite rightly, develops fights presuming these tools will exist, further entrenching them as mandatory and incentivizing guilds to run even more tools to surveil raid members and enforce compliance. And this is how a guild like mine ends up mirroring the practices of professionals. We aren't pursuing high ranks or looking to flatter our egos, we just want to enjoy ourselves. We just want a sense of forward momentum from week to week. But in Shadowlands, we found ourselves press people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, whether that's run keys, install mods, switch specs, or hell, switch
I'm out of
classes.
range.
It parallels the experience of Christine Ask, who writes that her 2009 guild, the Gummy Wolves, sought to temper their instrumental practices. They wanted to do well on their own terms, without just doing what elitist jerks did. They mocked the no-lifers who took the game too seriously, but yet were continually lured towards adopting the ideas and practices and strategies offered up by elitist jerks because, well, they work. Because that's the thing about these practices. They aren't arbitrary, they exist because they solve these problems. And if adopting some of these techniques is what gets your raid group from stalling out to comfortably succeeding, that's a trade-off that some would be happy to take. But for those players who are left behind, clearly the problem is the game itself. The co-evolution of WoW hit a dead end, if you catch my drift. This arms race between the devs and the players, it's gotten out of hand. What we need to do is hit the reset button, abandon all this nonsense and return to a simpler time. Surely that will fix this. When I first covered WoW Classic, I painted a picture of a game whose primary appeal was tourism, a chance to revisit a compelling game, but ultimately one without lasting appeal to a broad player base. I've received the odd request for a follow-up video every so often, and now seems like a good time as any to indulge. In the recent marketing for WoW Classic, Blizzard has leaned in hard on appealing to the nostalgia of a mainstream audience. The advertisements are aimed first and foremost at drawing back players who fell out of love with the game. I don't know, maybe I was onto something. However, this is not how a hardcore audience conceives of Classic.
Classic is a return to when the game was more pure. For example, a big complaint from the classic WoW purists are the difficulty modes that WoW introduced to dungeon and raid content in the first year of the Obama administration. Raids should be meritorious. Killing all bosses in a raid should be an achievement, and players should be sorted from one another. Not everyone should be able to finish the race. As an example, let's use Battle of Zara Law from 2019, the same year Classic WoW released. This is widely regarded as an excellent raid and may be among the best of the modern era. Here, we can see the distribution of progression for the hardest difficulty. This is where every guild who killed the boss finished up. For instance, Dan's guild killed the first 2 bosses on Mythic, so they're somewhere in this column. As you can see, the largest portion of guilds never killed the second boss. Twice as many as actually cleared it. The data tells us a story of the raid. You can see just how tough the 4th boss was relative to the first 3 by how many guilds never made it past it. The distribution drops hard after the first 3 bosses. This distribution resembles an ideal raid. Sure, Dan and his 2-decade-old friend group, they can see some bosses, they can do some stuff, but at a certain point, it's time for the men to take it. This graph isn't perfect. A Kungan type would probably tell you that too many people are clearing the raid, but it could be worse. Compare this to the normal mode distribution for the same raid. Normal mode represents everything that the classic purists hate about the modern game. It's a version of the raid intended for any group to be able to finish with the bare minimum of organization. We can see from the data that the vast majority of guilds who entered normal mode finished it. This number is pathetic. It fails to distribute players at all. No matter your skill level, you can expect to clear normal mode. A distribution like this, in the context of instrumental play, is terrifying. What does an objective-driven playstyle look like when the explicit objectives of the game can't provide an appropriate goal? Sure, some portions of the stack are well served by this raid, but some unknown number would be disengaged by this because it's just too easy. What would the game turn into for those players if they didn't have difficulty appropriate content? A distribution like this is deeply unhealthy for the game, and it's the reason why early WoW's raids were so difficult. I mean, that's Molten Core, man. It's the first raid they ever made. Of course it's going to be easy. Dan, again.
A lot of ink has been spilled on why Classic hasn't delivered on the difficulty promised by those early evangelists. We won't relitigate that in too much detail here. But in short, players are better, their internet is better, and for practical reasons the game runs on the final build of the expansion, so player characters end up being stronger than they ought to be. But the big one is the presence of paratest. It's not just that the content is 12 years old and everything has been solved, it's that the solution has been widely disseminated and widely adopted.
That's still recharging.
Like, here's a taste of a 3-hour lecture on changes to Shaman going from vanilla to the Burning Crusade. Please, I insist.
The testings of spell coefficients and weapon reviews I present here were done using a 2.4.3 TBC repack, which is not an official Blizzard product. Despite this, almost all spell coefficients and weapon and results that I've gathered corroborates what has been actually tested by multiple TBC era 3 crafters. However, until an official pre-patch, beta, and or live TBC game has been released, I cannot be 100% sure the spell coefficients and weapon and results are completely correct.
Yeah, we were always going to demolish Classic. It was always going to go this way. That's not to say that Sunwell or Ulduar Raid is an unenjoyable experience for modern players familiar with the game. It's just that it's not strictly a challenging one. The issue, then, that Classic faces is that the vast majority of players are exhausting the content at an absurd pace, most within the first week or two. These are people who love the game dearly and are magnitudes better than the creators could have imagined. What are they supposed to do to fill the time? Well, the same thing as anyone else who has a deep love of a single game. They started speedrunning. Speedrunning has been an element of WoW for basically the game's entire life, but before Classic WoW was released, private servers took it to a whole other level. These servers would spin up and shut down so rapidly that players developed techniques for speedrunning the entire game. Those players and their imitators applied their techniques to Classic WoW at launch. Molten Core was cleared in just 6 days, down from 154 days back in 2005. This was a big story in the Classic circles, but it didn't really affect the tourists in any meaningful way at launch. Over the life of Classic, more and more players found themselves adopting more and more of these speedrun techniques. Maybe it was an organic process, people just looking to make their raids easier and find a way to make them more engaging, but I would suggest that instrumental play compels players to try and organize themselves by hierarchy. Remember, the elitist players who want to gatekeep content, they're in here somewhere, so they are naturally going to elevate means of separating themselves from the pack. So speedrun practices become expert practices, and well, over the course of years, that cooks your brain. Classic ought to have been our salvation from all of this. After all, the content doesn't demand the kind of optimization we've been discussing, not by a long shot. And yet, it's gone the other way. Wrath of the Lich King Classic has become a nightmare of instrumental practices. Yes, it's not difficult, but the difficulty isn't the appeal. Instead, it's about going through this process perfectly. To be good at Classic is to learn and adopt the right practices, to play the right class at the right race with the best professions, to level the quickest, get served first, get that Shadowmourne that you never got back in the day. In some cases, it seems really weird. It's like reliving high school. This time, you're going to pick better electives, be cooler, bet on the Cubs in 2016, and smash when you got the chance. At the launch of Classic, these practices existed, but they were largely invisible. By definition, it did not mean anything to you that some guys were in Molten Core while you were in Wailing Caverns. Whatever. But after you quit Classic at level 47, these players, they stuck around, and they established the practices of what it meant to play Classic. This process of riding the curve to the greatest extent possible is not the exception, it's the rule. Again, look at these distributions. No child is being left behind here. If you're entering the raid, you're finishing it. Returning to Wrath Classic in late 2022, there is a palpable feeling that you've walked into their space. A walk around Dalaran showcases this. Every Death Knight and their ghoul is decked out in the best gear, the most prestigious vanity items. Every player looks like the protagonist. Things that were once status symbols are mundane. The best gear is not a symbol of exceptionalism, it's a symbol of parity. Having less than the best makes you less than everyone else, because if you aren't here, where else can you be? This was made crystal clear during the launch of Wrath Classic when players put absurd gear requirements on groups for Utgard Keep. If you wanted to experience Utgard Keep, the famously easy introductory dungeon on the first day of Wrath, a majority of groups expected you to have the best gear possible. Choice thought it was just his sweaty server, but no. YouTuber Azimus parodied this phenomenon, and the comments section is full of accounts of similar experiences.
Mad Orc, you are not good geared enough for this dungeon. What?
King's honor, friend.
Is he joking?
Like our trinket from earlier, it wasn't actually about efficiency. There is a limit on how many times you can do
Light
a dungeon
bless you.
within a given
Go
time.
with
It
honor,
was
friend.
not about efficiency. It was about reinforcing
For the
the
Alliance.
in-group and excluding the out-group.
Peace
The instrumental practices of Classic are no
May the
longer invisible.
stars guide
They're
you.
in your face. They're the status quo.
It is no doubt possible for a casual guild of 40-somethings to have fun on Classic, but like Christine Ask's guild back in 2009, these practices are endemic to Classic. There's no ivory tower for the best players to escape to. All of you want to do Naxxramas this week. I would argue that casual players feel more out of place on Classic because it disrupts an otherwise seamless flow of knowledgeable and overpowered players blowing through trivial content. This is the dissonance of the marketing of Classic. Blizzard wants Classic to be inviting to returning players, a chance to return to a humble era. Of course, this is bullshit. Wrath was the expansion that gave us Gear Score, which, if you want to talk about mods influencing social practices, there's a doozy for you. The social experience of Classic is immensely frustrating and incredibly fucking stressful. Once you step beyond the leveling experience, every dungeon or raid is a ritual of actions that have been accepted as standard and performed without introduction. It's disorienting to have ancient dungeons being done with private server routes. Stuff you were meant to learn 7 years ago from a Russian hunter on Warmane's Times 7 experience Blizz-like pre-nerf Wrath server. There is a tangible sense of always being behind the curve, always missing something. I was so excited for Classic TBC before I learned that a bunch of gear from Vanilla was just on the best in slot list. Like, the Mark of the Champion was being used all the way into Sunwell. It wasn't that I needed it to kill Brutalists, but it was the knowledge that I was already behind. Classic pushes you into one of two archetypes. Either you buy in and end up here, or you reject all of this and embrace the identity of a tourist. The hardcore players congregate on the same small handful of servers. The casual players find their servers starting to die and eventually need to either transfer to those same super realms or endure their degrading server until it eventually becomes unplayable and the players drop the game altogether. In other words, it's just like fucking retail. Despite the promise of a journey to a better yesterday, we ultimately recreated the same environment as the main game. Only there is no border to delineate between the intensity of content. For example, BDGG are a pseudo-professional guild. Our raiders are paid, in dollars, to play WoW and perform their best in the raid content. They have a lot of expectations to meet, and our analyst team has been hard at work discussing what needs to be done in preparation for this upcoming event. One conversation that hasn't really come up at all is the leveling process. Blizzard has had years to separate the leveling from the hardcore elements of the game. Our raiders need to get a certain number of characters to max level in the first week, and some are genuinely going to blitz it because that's just in their nature. But for our purposes, there is no need to prescribe a method to them or push them really hard to get it done quickly. They're allowed to take their time, react to cinematics with their viewers, explore, goof off, whatever. Many will experience the leveling of Dragonflight entirely organically, like you would or as I will. By contrast, check out this selection of guides on speedrunning to max level in Classic. There is a whole industry built on selling you instrumental practices. The funniest thing I saw in Classic were these guys who call themselves Team Supreme. So for context here, I joined a kind of middling guild on a middling PvE server for Classic, and I wanted to sort of strike that balance between hardcore and casual play. I wanted to do well and sort of skip the failure portion, but not have to go too hard. And within this guild were these guys, Team Supreme, and they were set